Ladies and gentlemen, removing feminists from the church is robbing the church of the greatest asset for reform and for change and for progress. Because those individuals can show that they hold every other value of that institution, they conform to every other moral standard, but on one issue that is more important to them or just as important to them, it is still valid and still able to hold all of those other values whilst also being a feminist. In those circumstances, it means that if the individuals get taken out of the institution, that they can be typecast as not conforming to the basic values of that institution in such a way as to make it look like they are not good Catholics, when instead they are great Catholics, but they are also good feminists. That is why they need to be in the church. That is why progress comes from within and not from without. Two questions in this debate. First, can feminist Christians choose to prioritize other values over those of their feminism? We told you that first. There wasn't anything that about a woman's feminism that meant that she couldn't make the prioritization of other incredibly important values to her. Those were things like tradition. Those were things like culture and community. Moreover, those were things like the fundamental tenet of feminism, that people should be able to make choices about their individuality and about what suits them and what is best for them. In those circumstances, there was no reason why they should be obliged, even if we weren't forcing them, why they should be obliged to make choices that were on behalf of the collective when the individual should be prioritized because the individual knows itself best. What did we hear most recently on this? They said feminists should never be morally inconsistent. First, the type of inconsistency that they are talking about, or what they've characterized as inconsistency, is in fact a reprioritization of certain values. It is not an inconsistency. It is saying that being a feminist is consistent with the Catholic faith. In those circumstances, that is the most pertinent challenge to the ideological notion that feminists and Catholicism are inconsistent. In those circumstances, that is the only way to challenge that notion. Two, this is a judgment that is only to be made by individuals. We think that if women can rationalize the consistency of feminism with their Catholic belief, then that is a decision for them to make and a value system to which they can ascribe. We don't think that necessarily it has to be a value system that is applicable to every other woman in society. It is still fine for them. It is still applicable. They then told us that we should prioritize, most recently, we should prioritize gender equality because people just opt into religion. First of all, opting in and immutable characteristics might be considered by one person to be just as important. They might consider the choice that they have made to opt into a religion to be just as important as the gender that they were born with. In those circumstances, that means that it's an equally valid decision to prioritize one over the other, in this case the religious values and the community and the tradition over the immutable sexual characteristic that they possess. But two, even if they do prioritize feminism, we say that all of the practical arguments that we told you about why feminists were better in the church than outside of the church were still true. That is why that analysis didn't apply. What did we hear really early on in their case? They said women can always choose to leave to other churches. First, these other churches are rarely sufficient for those women. They do not have the community ties. They do not have the cultural identity that is so important to them. Members of their family who are members of those communities, other important members of those of those communities. They don't have the same practices and traditions. But like just on more practical terms, they're not at the same church. They don't have the same meaning. The person hasn't been to that church for their entire life and shared all the values and all the experiences and maybe their marriage and maybe their baptism and maybe their confirmation at that church as well. We say in those circumstances that you can't just jump ship to another church because to that individual, the value of that church is something that inheres within that church rather than in the notion of religious identity as a kind of ephemeral notion. We said, and then two, this won't lead to a change within the church. It will lead to, as we told you all down our bench, a hothousing of beliefs when you remove feminists from the dialogue within the church about what constitutes women's position in society. And two, it removes all dissent and all possible rational explanation that you could have for an alternative opinion or idea. And finally, last reason why you couldn't just opt into another church was that the big churches that are pre-existing already have incredible institutional power. These are the churches that need to be changed, the churches that need to be affected. We couldn't just be like, ship all the women out to make reformist churches, because in so much as the reformist churches become good, the ones in the institutions that have problems that need to be reformed don't become any better. In those circumstances, that was still particularly problematic for when individuals who were non-feminists in those churches and were being victimized by the anti-misogynistic banter or whatever it was, but also for the individuals who were feminists in those churches. They also said that women need to reject all of the tropes and all of the doctrines because that sends the strongest message in a community. First, women who are both feminists and practice religion, culture, and values make the best role models. As I told you in my introduction, it is individuals who say it is entirely consistent for me to practice the Catholic faith and also be a feminist while still being inside that church, that prioritize those values best, that send the best message, and say that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Say that the church is effectively lying to you when it says you can't be a feminist but also a Catholic. And two, As Dan said, when there are separatist or reform movements, it is very easy for the church to typecast them as being incorrect or as being different or as not being consistent with all of your Catholic values rather than just being feminist or just prioritizing feminist values. We think that when you ship the people out of the church and you give people less contact with those individuals, they don't have to share religious ceremonies or traditions with those individuals, that reduction of contact necessarily means there is a reduction in the effectiveness of changing those institutions. That is why, principally, women should not be obliged to ship out of institutional churches that are bigoted or are misogynistic merely by virtue of their being feminists. Second question in this debate. Would the leaving of women from the Catholic Church increase progressive reforms? We told you that first, as I said, they're in the best position to persuade. They are rational. They are well-resourced. They've often considered the arguments of the religious tenets versus the feminist arguments. Two, that the level of discussion that they brought to the table was often based on theological arguments that people within the institutions would probably buy because they had to reason those things through. They had to rationalize those things. Three, there are excellent role models. And four, when you remove alternative opposition, obviously negative things result in that church because the dialogue is reduced. What did they say most recently? They said that the Catholic Church made a realization about condoms, but that realization wasn't particularly significant. First, we say that the realization about condoms for the Catholic Church, which was a reform that occurred from within, is a very big rejection of incredibly strongly held views within that church. Views which came from Thomas Aquinas, views which a huge number of people in that church internalized as being incredibly important. But two, contrary to their analysis about people leaving churches and churches reforming, the Catholic Church consistently doesn't reform on loads of other values, even though their numbers are dwindling. We say in those circumstances that it might be a different basis for the values. They said that you can't change your values because they are always based on religious doctrine in the circumstances. In that circumstance, neither side wins this debate because there is no change ever to be achieved in religion. But two, it was a total contradiction with what their first speaker said, that leaving churches meant that there was more accountability for those churches, or leaving churches sent the message that the churches needed to change. What did they bring us at second? They said feminism has always achieved its outcome by using women as some kind of like a social battering ram. Well, first, separatist feminism has not been useful in a very large number of circumstances. It causes resistance. It makes it really easy to typecast them as just being militant women or just being oppositional or just being defiant, rather than individuals who are part of our community, who are one of us, who make rational decisions on their own behalf and prioritize certain things for themselves. But two, on a more practical level, it reduces the amount of contact that everybody within that church community has with these really good feminist women, because they are no longer attending all of the services that you have, no longer sharing the common practices that you have, which are the fundamental connection which individuals within a religious community share with one another. The last thing that they also said that this was bad for women because it caused harm to certain women in the church. It caused harm to feminist women in the church. First of all, we think that most feminists who are in the church don't believe in their inherent worseness because they have feminist values. Therefore, they're not harmed by the fact that the church says you are worse because they don't believe it in the first place. But two, even for women who are feminists, no worries. What did we hear at first? They said the church has realized that they need popular support. We also heard this at third. First, there was no reason that was true. Churches are united by values and beliefs rather than the number of people that attend those churches. But this is really clear from the fact that churches have strongly resisted things that are popular. They've resisted abortion. They still, in many cases, resist contraception. That is why feminists should not be obliged to leave religions merely by virtue of being feminists. That is why they should have the choice. That is why we are proud to oppose.
In the debate between the University of Melbourne 10 and the University of Sydney Union 1, the team progressing to the grand final is the University of Sydney Union 1.
Education, interaction, understanding. This is APAC.